Hello. Today, I want to tell you about one of the strangest and most terrifying disasters in American history. The Dust Bowl, and the day when a wall of black dust turned daylight into darkness. It happened in the 1930s, across the Great Plains, a huge open region in the center of the United States, where ordinary farming families were trying to build a future from the land beneath their feet. Over the course of a few terrible years, the same land that had promised them a new life slowly began to turn against them. Dust filled their homes, buried their roads, killed their animals, and got into their food, their beds, their water, and their lungs. Then, on one Sunday in 1935, a wall of black dust rolled across the plains and turned day into night. That day became known as Black Sunday, the darkest day of the Dust Bowl. To understand how something like that could happen, we have to go back to the beginning, before the dust, before the ruined farms, and before the sky turned black. The Great Plains were once covered by wild grass, not short lawn grass, but tall, tough prairie grass that stretched across the land like a sea. That grass had roots that went deep underground, holding the loose soil together like a net. Wind could bend the grass, flatten it, and tear at it for days, but the ground itself stayed where it was. Then settlers began to arrive, and for families with little money, the plains looked like a miracle. Land was cheap, sometimes almost free, and a person could come west, build a home, plant wheat, and believe that a better life was finally possible. They were also sold a dangerous idea. If farmers plowed the fields, the rain would follow. Many believed that farming itself could change the climate, and that the more land people broke open, the more rain would come. It sounded like science, but it was really hope dressed up as a sales pitch. The wheat grew, families made money, towns appeared where empty land had been, trains carried grain away, and new machines arrived. The plains looked rich, useful, and endless. Then the First World War made wheat even more valuable. Europe needed food, wheat prices rose, and farmers began to look at the land as money waiting to be harvested. The more they planted, the more they could earn. So they planted more land, then more again, and then even more. New tractors and machines made the process faster than ever before. A tractor could plow in a day what once took a week, and millions of acres of prairie grass went under steel blades. Almost nobody stopped to ask the most important question: what had that grass been holding? They were tearing out the only thing that kept the soil on the ground. Then, in the early 1930s, the rain stopped. It did not stop for a week or for one bad season. A long drought settled over the plains. The wheat dried up and died, and beneath it lay bare, broken, unprotected soil. Without grass and roots, the soil turned into powder, fine, dry, loose powder, almost like flour. And on the Great Plains, the wind almost never truly rests. The wind picked up that dead soil and carried it into the air, first in small clouds, then in larger storms, and finally in walls of dust so thick they could swallow roads, farms, and entire towns. At first, people tried to live with it by sweeping dust out of their houses again and again, covering windows and doors with wet cloth, and covering food while they ate. But no matter what they did, the dust always came back. It slipped through cracks, settled on tables, covered beds, and got inside shoes, drawers, dishes, and blankets. Children woke up with grit in their mouths, and the dust was no longer just outside the home. It had become part of the home. It also entered people's bodies. Breathing dust for days could clog the lungs, leaving people coughing, gasping for air, growing weaker, and sometimes dying from what doctors called dust pneumonia. Children and older people suffered the most. The storms carried strange effects too. Static electricity built up in the air, sometimes stopping car engines, and people avoided touching each other because even a handshake could snap like an electric shock. The dust felt alive. While families fought to keep it out of their homes, the farms outside were dying. Livestock breathed the same dust in open fields, animals collapsed, crops failed, money disappeared, and families saved every drop of water while they waited for rain that did not come. Every year, the storms grew worse. In 1932, there were 14 major dust storms, and in 1933, there were 38. Dust traveled hundreds, and sometimes thousands of miles, falling on Washington, reaching New York, and even drifting out to ships at sea. The whole country began to understand that something had gone terribly wrong. And then came April 14th, 1935. That Sunday morning was strangely beautiful. For the first time in months, the sky was clear, the air was warm, and the wind was quiet. After so much dust, the day felt almost merciful. People stepped outside, visited neighbors, worked around the house, and went to church. Some may have thought the worst had finally passed, because for a few hours, the plains looked peaceful again. Later that afternoon, someone looked north and stopped. A dark shape was rising on the horizon, and at first, it may have looked like weather. But then it grew too tall, too black, and too solid to be a normal cloud. It was a wall of dust, hundreds of meters high, moving across the plains like a living thing. Birds flew ahead of it in panic, trying to escape, and when people saw them, they understood what was coming and ran for their homes, with only minutes before the wall reached them. When the storm hit, the bright afternoon turned black almost instantly. It was not gray or cloudy. It was black. People could hold a hand in front of their face and lose sight of it. Anyone caught outside could get lost only steps from their own door, so some families stretched ropes between buildings to move by touch. Inside, people huddled together, pressed wet cloth to their faces, and waited in darkness while dust forced its way through every crack. The storm raged for hours as people prayed, children cried, and rooms filled with dust, even when doors and windows had been sealed as tightly as families knew how. Many believed they were watching the end of the world. When the storm finally passed, everything looked buried. Homes, cars, fences, and roads were covered, and people stepped outside to a landscape that no longer looked like the place they had known. The next day, newspapers across the country wrote about the storm. A reporter traveling through the region gave the ruined land a name that stayed forever: the Dust Bowl. After Black Sunday, many families reached the limit. Staying meant debt, sickness, hunger, and another storm, while leaving meant abandoning everything they had tried to build. So hundreds of thousands of people packed what they could into old cars and trucks, mattresses, tools, dishes, clothes, children, and whatever else could fit. They drove west toward California because they had heard there was work and water there. But the road did not lead to an easy rescue. Work was scarce, wages were low, and locals often hated the newcomers and called them Okies, even when they came from other states. In all, about 2.5 million people left the plains, not because they wanted adventure, but because the ground beneath their feet had turned to dust.
Declined instead of increased during the winter months, and they are still the relief program, the second.
In Washington, the disaster could no longer be ignored. The government began treating the Dust Bowl not just as bad weather, but as a man-made crisis tied to farming, poverty, and the way the land had been used. The response was not one miracle fix, it was work. There were water projects, soil conservation programs, new farming methods, and experts teaching farmers how to keep the ground from blowing away again. Farmers were taught to plow along the curves of the land instead of cutting straight lines across it, with a simple goal: slow the water, slow the wind, and hold the soil in place. Workers planted long rows of trees to break the force of the wind, and some of the worst land was taken out of production and allowed to rest. Slowly, the idea changed. The land was not endless, and it had limits. At the end of the 1930s, the rains finally returned. Grass and crops slowly came back, and the great storms became fewer. But the memory of Black Sunday stayed. The land looks patient, and it can seem too large to break. But if people take too much from it for too long, one day it stops forgiving. The Dust Bowl did not begin with the weather. It began with the plow, and with wanting more. At the center of this story are ordinary families who lived through years of dust and still kept going. They survived the day the sky turned black, and that is worth remembering.